Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and this is week 3 of our History of Virginia class. And I just wanted to bring up something that we often kind of misconstrue and don't think about when we're studying early American history. We tend to keep our lens on our glasses that we look through, our bias, our perspective, and we don't put on the glasses of a historian and look back at through his glasses at the time period in which we're talking. One of the instances that we most often miss is who were these people that were now colonists in the Americas? And we tend to think that all things continue on as they've always been. These were Americans. They talked like Americans and they acted like Americans, and they went about doing their business the way we do it today. Nothing could be further from the truth. First of all, let me say something about the founding fathers, and they were the elites of the society. In fact, they will loan much of the initial money to uh, the revolution, and they will be owed money when the revolution is over. And many of them had sacrificed their fortune to bring about the revolution. But you've got to remember that most of the people living in the country were not elite, they were not wealthy, and as with any war that we've ever had, and I can go back and show you war by war, how we sold the war to the common person, you'll see the revolution was no different. You would know from maybe if you were around during the Iraqi war that we sold that with the idea of weapons of mass destruction. Well, in the revolutionary days, they sold that war to the common people with Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And his book had a great effect. People were literate then, very much so. They read, they were very literate. In fact, I think I read that somewhere in the colonies were 83% literate. So they were reading people. Of course, they did not have all the media, the TV, the things that we enjoy today. So reading was a major part of their academic intelligence and endeavors. But you have to remember that these people also are British citizens, and they have grown up under the guise of the King of England, the ruler of England. It would have been a king at this point in time, and so they knew very well what it was to be a British citizen. It was almost like Paul in the Bible when they were going to whip Paul, you remember, in the book of Acts, and suddenly it came to light that Paul was a Roman citizen. And Roman citizens had certain rights. They could not be whipped. If you went over one lash in whipping a Roman citizen, that soldier could be put to death. And so Paul mentions that they whipped him 5 times, 39 lashes. And they didn't go the 40 lest they miscounted and would endanger their life. So you carried certain rights. Paul had the right, you remember, to appeal to Caesar when he was given a death sentence, and he did just that in the end of the book of Acts. So it was something like that to be a British citizen. You had certain rights and privileges. They complained about taxation, but the reality was that they didn't pay any taxes. Their counterparts in England were basically being taxed to death. There was a lot of resentment there because the English citizens at home paid exorbitant taxes. The English citizens in America paid no taxes, and they were getting the protection of the army. The British were really tapped out financially. They had just ended the 30 Years' War, and of course, that spilled over to America. That was the First World War, technically, in that it was fought all around the world where Britain and other nations had interest, and so it spread everywhere, even to the colonies. And we call that the French and Indian War. And they put troops here to protect the colonists that were here. Those troops stayed in the colonist homes, which was a point of resentment, but they resented paying any taxes. They didn't want to pay any. And so you can understand why the Boston Tea Party ended the way it did, why the St. Bartholomew Day massacre ended the way it did. It was basically a rebellious group trying to extend that lack of taxes or whatever. But they're British citizens. They're not speaking with a Southern accent. They're not speaking with a Northern accent. They're speaking with a British accent. As we go into the war, the country's divided. It is not a consensus where everybody is up in arms and ready to defeat the British and end their rule and become a country. That is not even on the drawing board. In fact, the elites probably never dreamed of withdrawing from the country until they get to the Declaration of Independence. They just want to have their grievances heard, representation in Parliament increased. And you also have to remember on the British side, there's always two perspectives to this. There is the British perspective, there's the American. We think we were the only ones, but we're not. A few years ago, they were cleaning up the attic of the Parliament and came across this old box. And in that old box was the original Declaration of Independence that was sent from the colonies to England, declaring themselves independent. And we're going kind of ape of it. Oh, this is our document. This is our declaration, because we put so much veneration in this document to the British. It's just some letter from a bunch of rebels that we threw in a box and put it in the attic. So you got to remember there's always a double-sided perspective to what is going on here. And it's always interesting, if you want a true view, to get both sides of the story. And so there is a British side and there is a colonist side, if you will. But they, these guys were, when they finally reached the point of breaking with England, there was no going back. Benjamin Franklin said, we must all hang together or we most surely will hang separately. They put their lives on the line to do just that. But remember, they're still British people. And so the country's evenly divided. There are Tories. Those that decided with the British are still very much present, and they spied and they did things to help the British Army in their war against these revolutionaries. There are also revolutionaries that are on the side of the elites that are calling for the revolution, and they spy and they help and they supply what's needed. So this is a civil war, if you will, among British citizens in the colonies over who is going to lead them. The question I wanted to center on, just as a thought, was when did these colonists begin to think of themselves as Americans? They're not Americans at the beginning when they do the Declaration of Independence. They're not thinking much beyond the war. Probably don't expect to win the war. And the Indian tribes sided with the British because the British had taken especially the Cherokee chiefs, Attaculla and others, to England. They had seen the ships and the armies, the things that England had, and they said, there's no way that these people could win this war against the British Empire. And nobody was probably more surprised when they did than the American colonists themselves. And it was really quite an interesting display of ingenuity. It was a stroke of divine blessing, maybe, that it ended up the way that it did. And if you want to see a really good movie, you guys may have missed it. You might be younger than that. But The Patriot by Mel Gibson, with Mel Gibson in it, is a really good movie and probably very close to historical fact. So I would encourage you to read that. So when did they start thinking about being Americans? After the war's over. There is 10 years between the end of the war of 1781. 1783, we get a peace treaty with the British. 1787, they finally meet to discuss a constitution. 1789, that constitution is finally ratified. It's almost a decade. What did they do in that decade? They went back home to their colonies, formed a state government, and each place operated more or less as a separate country. They were operating under the Articles of Confederation, which were really, really loose, really, really weak. And so each country had to have its own trade laws and trade charters, and they had to have their own diplomats. And so they did that until about until 1787, when they came together in Philadelphia to discuss what kind of government they were going to have. Still not thinking about themselves as Americans. Maybe by this, you're a citizen of South Carolina, you're a citizen of Massachusetts, whatever it was. So they meet together in 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they scrap them, and they are in deliberation as to a form of government. Now, let me tell you something I recently found out that just kind of blew my mind. When we talk about democracy and republic, you realize that our country is not a democracy. The only real democracy in Western history, notice I'm saying Western history, was Athens, Greece. One man, one vote. It never happened again. There were no examples in Western powers of a democracy, but there was a huge example among Native Americans. The Iroquoian Confederacy in the north around New York had been functioning for hundreds of years. This confederacy was made up of many tribes, the Tuscarora, the Huron, on and on we could go, naming there's 5 or 6 tribes there. Each of them elected representatives that came together. They made laws and rulings, and they functioned that way. In fact, what's so distinct about this is that Benjamin Franklin brings up this example in the 1787 Constitutional Convention and says this is the kind of democracy we should think about in forming the country. And I think if that's true, and I've got more research to do on this, but I think it's really unique that the people that we end up destroying and driving to the West and almost committing genocide were the ones we take their example and build our country on. It was a true representative democracy, the kind that was modeled in the setting up of the country. So 1789, we still have we have a new constitution. People aren't really thinking of themselves still as Americans, because during this period the British will stop our ships at sea. They will impress our sailors, especially if they hear sailors that still have a British accent, force them onto their ships, carry them off to God knows where, and make them sailors for the British Navy. It is not until the War of 1812, and we win that one too. Amazing. We don't have much in the way of army. We don't have much in the way of navy at all. We don't win any battles on the land except the Battle of New Orleans. And the only reason we win that is, maybe not the only reason we win, but we win that one after the Treaty of Ghent is signed. So 1812, the war's over. And Andrew Jackson, either he knows that the war's over and he does it deliberately, or he presses on not knowing and defeats the British at the Battle of New Orleans. But we do well at sea. We win sea battles with no navy to speak of. And we get our great songs from the War of 1812. But it's after the War of 1812 that we begin to think about, hey, we're Americans. We're not British. We're not anything else. We're Americans. And so I think some of these things might prove to be a point of interest, at least something to think about. History is not what you think it is. It's not this civic history, as Benjamin Franklin said, that you learned in high school. That's the story we tell ourselves about ourselves that we use in nation building. But the real story is the Paul Harvey version. I know you don't remember him. He used to have a radio program in which he would weave this story for 20 minutes on history of some unusual occurrence. He'd say, now at the 20-minute hour, he'd say, we'll go break for a commercial, and when I come back, I'll tell you the rest of the story. And when he came back, the rest of the story would just kind of wipe you out. I mean, it was just unbelievable. It was so startling. Great commentator. Well, that's kind of how American history is. You think you know the story, but then when you start digging around in the archives and working on the story, you say, hey, the story ends quite differently than the way we projected it. So I thought I would spend a little time sharing that with you today. I would love to hear back from you. If you will listen to the video, just drop me a line and tell me what you think, what you find interesting, what you find fascinating. And I appreciate you listening. Thank you.